Leo Eugen Janáček was born on July 3, 1854 in the small village of Hochwalde, Moravia, then a part of the Austrian Empire. He was the ninth of 14 kids. His father, Jiří, was a schoolmaster from Albertičky. His mother, Amalie, was an organist from Přibor. Leoš was a gifted child, showing musical talent quite early while singing in choirs. His father wanted him to become a teacher, as was the family tradition, but relented due to Leoš's musical talent. At age 11, Leoš enrolled as a ward for St. Thomas's Abbey in Brno. While there, he took part in the choir under conductor Pavel Krzyżkowski. He would also occasionally play the organ. One of Leoš's classmates at the Abbey, conductor František Newman, said Leoš was, quote, an excellent pianist who played Beethoven's symphonies perfectly in a piano duet with a classmate under Krzyżkowski's supervision. Throughout his time at school, Janáček's strong opinions on music led to conflict with those around him. He wasn't afraid of criticizing his teachers, who considered him a defiant student. Krzyżkowski even considered him problematic, but would still recommend his entry into the Prague organ school. Janáček would later say that he remembered Krzyżkowski as a great conductor and teacher. While Janáček would eventually devote himself to composition, he originally intended to study the piano and organ. He wrote his first vocal compositions while serving as the choir master of the Svatopluk Artisans Association. Janáček enrolled in the Prague organ school in 1874, and studied under František Skuherský and František Blažek. He didn't have a piano in his dorm room, having to draw a keyboard on a table in order to practice. Janáček would meet and become friends with Antonín Dvořák. In March of 1875, a journal published a review made by Janáček where he criticized Skuherský's performance of the Gregorian Mass. This review almost had Janáček expelled from the organ school, but Skuherský would let him stay. Janáček graduated from the organ school as the best in his class in 1875. He became the choir master for the Umělecká beseda, a Czech artistic association founded in 1863, and also began teaching at the Slavonic Teachers Institute in Brno. Interestingly, his students found him strict and uncompromising, despite Janáček himself openly disagreeing with his own teachers. One of Janáček's students was the daughter of the institute's director, Zdenka Šulcová. Janáček eventually married her in 1881 when she was 15.
Oh, hey, everybody know ain't no party like a Diddy party.
They would have 2 children. Janáček was then voted choir master of the Beseda Brněnská Philharmonic Society in 1876, which he held for 12 years. Starting in 1877, Janáček began writing essays and articles on music theory for a variety of journals, which he continued to do for the remainder of his life. He then began studying piano, organ, and composition at the Leipzig Conservatory in 1879 under Oscar Paul and Leo Grill. Janáček composed Zdenka's variations for piano while at the conservatory. He wasn't satisfied during his time in Leipzig and was denied a studentship with French composer Camille Saint-Saëns. He then moved to the Vienna Conservatory in 1880 and studied composition under Franz Kren and piano under Josef Dachs. Janáček's time in Vienna wouldn't last long either. He didn't like Kren's style of neo-romanticism and would also quit Dachs's piano classes after being criticized for his technique. While he did submit a violin sonata to a competition at the conservatory, which was rejected for being, quote, too academic, Janáček would leave the Vienna Conservatory after only 2 months. In 1881, Janáček founded and was appointed the director of an organ school, a position he would hold for nearly 40 years. Some of his students here included Pavel Haas, Brzeslav Bakala, and Vilém Petrželka. Janáček began composing more, including 4 pieces for male chorus and his first opera, Šárka. He would also begin collecting and studying folk music throughout Eastern Europe, which would heavily influence his music from then on. In his research, Janáček found that peasant musicians didn't know the names of specific Moravian modes, and had their own ways of referring to them. He would coin the term Moravian modulation for a progression from 1 to flat 7, which he considered a general characteristic of Moravian folk music. In early 1887, a scathing review of an opera written by Karel Kovařovič was published in a journal. The review was written by Janáček, and part of it reads as follows, quote, "Which melody stuck in your mind? Which motif? Is this dramatic opera? No, I would write on the poster, comedy performed together with music, since the music and the libretto aren't connected to each other." After the publication of this review, Janáček and Kovařovič wouldn't get along. Janáček would meet the late Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky at a performance of his music in 1888 in Prague. Janáček greatly admired Tchaikovsky, and particularly appreciated his musical thought in connection to Russian folk motifs. Janáček continued collecting folk music throughout Moravian Silesia, and compiled these tunes into various piano and orchestral arrangements. Most of the tunes were collected by Janáček himself, while others were collected by folklorist Severa Behalkova. He would meet another folklorist named František Bartoš, who helped Janáček further his interest in folk music. Following the death of his son Vladimir in 1890, Janáček would write his second opera, The Beginning of a Romance. Janáček was one of the organizers of the Czech Slavic Folklore Exhibition, which was an important event in Czech culture. In addition to his home country, Janáček also had a lifelong affection for Russia and Russian culture. He would read the works of Russian authors in their original language, which gave him a large and reliable source of inspiration for his compositions. Janáček would travel to Russia for the first time in 1896. Afterwards, he wrote a 5-movement cantata called Amaris in 1897. At the start of the 20th century, Janáček wrote various choral church works, including Oče náš, Constituis, and Ave Maria. He would also write his piano cycle On an Overgrown Path in 1901, which would gradually become one of his most performed works. Janáček would visit Russia twice more in 1902. His daughter Olga would stay to study in St. Petersburg, but would get extremely sick while there. Olga would tragically die of typhus fever in 1903. Following her death, Janáček would experience difficulties in his personal and professional life. He nearly gave up being a composer, saying, quote, "I was beaten down. My own students gave me advice, how to compose, how to speak through the orchestra." Janáček would write Elegy on the Death of My Daughter Olga, as well as his third opera, Jenůfa, which he would dedicate to his daughter. The opera premiered in Brno in 1904 to reasonable success. Janáček aspired to have it performed by the National Theatre in Prague, but the opera would unfortunately not be performed in Prague for another 14 years. His lack of recognition in Prague led him to destroying some of his works. Dejected from his opera not being performed in the city, Janáček traveled to Luhačovice, a spa town in eastern Bohemia. There he met Kamila Orvalkova. Orvalkova came from a rich family and was dating composer Ludvík Čelanský, who came from a poor family. Her father forced her to break up with him, which led to Čelanský writing his opera Kamila as a form of revenge. Believing Čelanský had depicted her personality falsely, Orvalkova persuaded Janáček to write an opera based on her life story. This culminated in Janáček's fourth opera Osud, completed in 1905 and revised 2 years later. The libretto was written by composer Fedora Bartošová. The opera wouldn't be staged until 6 years after Janáček's death. In 1905, Janáček attended a demonstration in support of a Czech university in Brno. The death of a young Czech carpenter by the police inspired Janáček to write his first piano sonata, From the Street. He would continue to promote anti-German and anti-Austrian sentiment and was officially banned by the Austrian police 10 years later. Also in 1905, Janáček became president of the Working Committee for Czech National Folk Song in Moravian Silesia. Janáček would collaborate with poet Petr Bezruč, using his poems in a number of pieces. Other pieces written around this time include Večné Evangelium, Pohádka for cello and piano, and his fifth opera, The Excursions of Mr. Broček. In 1916, Janáček met author Max Brod. The two would develop a personal and professional relationship. In addition, Kovařovic revised his opera Jenůfa, which Janáček would begrudgingly allow. The opera was finally staged in Prague in 1916 to great success. After the premiere, Janáček would meet singer Gabriela Horvátová, whom he became captivated with. He didn't hide this captivation from his wife Zdenka, which led to her attempting. On Christmas in 1916, Zdenka tried to divorce Janáček after he suspected her of sending an anonymous letter to Horvátová. The two settled for an informal divorce, living separate lives in the same home. Janáček would eventually lose interest in Horvátová, but this wouldn't be the end of his escapades. In 1917, Janáček met a woman named Kamila Štoslova, with whom he would fall madly in love with. He began an obsessive and passionate correspondence with her, consisting of well over 700 letters. Keep in mind, Štoslova was married, had 2 kids, and was 38 years Janáček's junior. Despite this, she never sought nor rejected his devotion. Janáček would write The Diary of One Who Disappeared and his 6th opera Kaja Kabanova, both of which were inspired by Štoslova. Soon after, he retired from his position as director of his organ school, which had merged with 2 other schools to form the Brno Conservatory. Janáček would write his 7th opera, The Cunning Little Vixen, in 1923, which was inspired by a novella written by Rudolf Tesnochlídek. In 1924, Brod would publish a biography of Janáček. In addition, Janáček was interviewed by American music critic Olin Downs for the New York Times. He would officially retire from teaching in 1925 and receive an honorary doctorate from Masaryk University in Brno. 1926 was a very pivotal year for Janáček. He wrote 2 major works for orchestra, the first of which being the Sinfonietta. It premiered in Prague, conducted by Václav Talek to enormous success. The second piece was Glagolitic Mass, an 8-movement mass setting with the text entirely in Old Church Slavonic. Janáček then traveled to England after receiving an invitation from poet Rosa Newmarch. Many of his works were performed in London while he was there. Janáček became an international celebrity during the last years of his life. He became a member of the Prussian Academy of Arts in Berlin in 1927. He then wrote his 8th and final opera, From the House of the Dead, based on the novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, as well as his second string quartet titled Intimate Letters, which was inspired by Šťastlova. Speaking of Šťastlova, throughout their correspondence, Janáček pleaded with her to go by a first-name basis in their letters. Šťastlova eventually signed one of her letters to Janáček with Your Camilla in 1927. Zdenka found the letter, and it led to a fight between her and Janáček. Janáček, for some reason, planned to make his feelings about Šťastlova public, but Brod had persuaded him against it. In mid-1928, Janáček traveled with Šťastlova and her son Otto to the town of Stromberg. While there, he caught a chill which eventually developed into pneumonia. On August 12, 1928, Janáček died at a sanatorium in Ostrava at the age of 74. A large public funeral was held which included music from the last scene of his opera, The Cunning Little Vixen. Janáček was buried in the honorary burial ground at Central Cemetery in Brno with his 2 children and his wife Zdenka, who died in 1938. Janáček's contemporaries would describe him as mistrustful and reserved, but obsessively passionate for those he loved. His letters between him and Šťastlova are an important source for his inspiration. On the other hand, Janáček's letters between him and his wife Zdenka were quite mundane. It's possible that Zdenka destroyed all of her letters to her husband, with only a few postcards surviving. The majority of Janáček's more well-known music was written in the last decade of his life. His early style was a more romantic one, but he would soon absorb elements of Moravian and Slovak folk music after his first opera. He even acquired an Edison phonograph in 1909 and became one of the first people to use phonographic recording as a folklore research tool. Several of these recording sessions survive and were compiled and reissued in 1998. According to Jiří Senhal and Jiří Vysložil in their book History of Music in Moravia, Janáček sought realism and connection with everyday life, and would make an all-encompassing use of resources. French conductor and serialist composer Pierre Boulez said that Janáček's music was surprisingly modern and fresh. Boulez would call Janáček's final opera, quote, primitive in the best sense, but also extremely strong, like the paintings of Leger, where the rudimentary character allows a very vigorous kind of expression. A really interesting element of Janáček's style includes its incorporation of elements of Moravian dialects of the Czech language, including the inflections, rhythm, and contour of the pitch. He would also study the ways in which all of these elements would change. This is most evident in the finale of his opera Jenůfa. Janáček had an expanded view of tonality, which includes unorthodox chord voicings and the use of modes. Janáček himself would say, quote, there is no music without key. Atonality abolishes definite key and thus tonal modulation. Folksong knows of no atonality. Some composers who have influenced Janáček's music include his friend Dvorak, as well as Italian composer Giacomo Puccini. According to musicologist Jim Sampson in his book Music in Transition, A Study of Tonal Expansion and Atonality in 1900-1920, Janáček's method of developing accompaniment in his work is, quote, often a discourse of short, unfinished phrases comprising constant repetitions of short motifs, which gather momentum in a cumulative manner. Janáček himself will call these motifs skasovky. The word doesn't have a direct translation into English, but musicologist John Tyrrell, who is a leading specialist on Janáček's music, described it as, quote, a little flash of time, almost a kind of musical capsule, which Janáček often used in slow music as tiny swift motifs with relatively characteristic rhythms that are supposed to pepper the music flow. Australian conductor Sir Charles Mackerras, who would promote Janáček's music throughout the 20th century, considered him as the first minimalist composer. Throughout his life, Janáček wrote numerous essays, articles, and extensive studies discussing various topics related to music, including form, melody and harmony, counterpoint, and more. The world of Czech musicology at the start of the 20th century was heavily influenced by Romanticism. Specific composers highlighted include Richard Wagner and Czech composer Bedřich Smetana. Performance practices were typically conservative and resistant to innovation. Czech musicologist Zdeněk Nejedlý, who would later become the Minister of Culture for the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, said Janáček was someone who could accumulate a lot of material but couldn't do anything with it. He would also call Janáček's style, quote, unanimated, and consider him an amateur composer. According to Mackerras, Nejedlý tried to destroy Janáček's career. Talek, who conducted the premiere of Janáček's Sinfonietta, would often adjust some of Janáček's scores. He justified his reorchestrations of Talas Boba and The Cunning Little Vixen by saying, quote, it was not possible to perform it in the Prague National Theatre unless it was entirely reorchestrated. Talek was harshly criticized for these reorchestrations, but for many years they were considered standard. Mackerras would eventually restore many of Janáček's original orchestrations. Janáček, along with Dvorak and Smetana, are considered the most important composers of the Czech Republic. Janáček's chamber works are widely considered to be classics of 20th century music, in particular his 2-string quartets. Other interesting facts about Janáček include him being the subject of many documentary films, as well as having an orchestra, an airport, and an asteroid named after him.